Okay, it started. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Today we are continuing the Shemona Perakim, the 8 chapters introduction of Maimonides to Pirkei Avot, right? The ethics of our fathers. We are on chapter 6, right? So we've already discussed the structure of the Nefesh, the different parts of the Nefesh, what parts of the Nefesh are responsible for our desires, and what parts of the Nefesh, right, we have misvot and avirot associated with, and how to heal our Nefesh if it goes sick, and what causes it sickness, and what brings it health. And now we're going to discuss a question of the philosophers and what's the Torah approach, and do they conflict? So it says Amru HaPhilosophim, right? The philosopher said שהמושל בנפשו אף על פי שעשה המעשים הטובים והחשובים הוא עושה אותם והוא מתאווה לפעולות הרעות ונחשף אליהם. So the philosophers are talking about how about a person, right? We discussed in the previous chapter that we need to direct all the functions of our nefesh, right, to under our rational thought, right? Make conscious decisions of what we do and how we affect our nefesh. And certain actions that we do can ruin our nefesh, and certain actions that we do can be indicative of a sick nefesh or a healthy nefesh. And they said, so how about someone who is moshel benafsho, which we said is a great virtue, is what we are all aspiring to, right? He controls his nefesh. He has ta'avot to do things that are forbidden, but he prevents himself from doing it, right? He wants to do, sorry, this I think. He overcomes his desire to do something bad, but his desire is to do something that's forbidden. Right, so he has certain inclinations in his nefesh that are pushing him to do forbidden things, which could be indicative of a sick or a bad nefesh. But he overcomes that, and he makes himself do the proper actions, to behave properly. But when he's doing these good deeds, he is feeling sorrow that he's not able to do what he really wants to be doing. It says, Avala Hasid, however, someone who is pious, someone who is a Sadiq, a Hasid, הוא שנמשך בפעולתו אחר מה שתראהו תאוותו ותכונתו ויעשה הטובות והוא מתאווה ונחשף אליהן. However, someone who is pious or someone who is a Sadiq is somebody who does the good deeds because his nefesh craves doing the good deeds. Doesn't need to overcome a bad ta'avot of the nefesh. ובהסכמה מן הפילוסופים, and all of the philosophers agree, שהחסיד יותר חשוב ויותר שלם מן המושל בנפשו. And they all agree that somebody who desires good deeds is on a higher level than someone who desires doing things that are asur, but overcomes that desire. Meaning there's two people, they're doing the exact same actions. They're behaving in the exact same way. However, one is overcoming his desire to do the opposite, and the other one is doing it because that's his natural inclination. So who is greater? Who is on a higher level? So he says all of the philosophers agree that he who naturally craves doing the good deeds is on a higher level than he who naturally craves the bad deeds, but overcomes that desire, overrides it, and does good deeds anyways. אבל אמרו, and they said, שהמושל בנפשו כחסיד בעניינים רבים, right? It says that somebody overcomes those evil desires. He is like a Hasid, he's like a pious person, right? In many things. However, he's on a lower level than the true Sadiq. Because he craves doing bad. And even though he doesn't act upon those cravings, right? This craving that he has to do something wrong is indicative of a bad midah in his nefesh, and therefore, even though he overcomes that craving and does good, he's on a lower level than the true Sadiq who has no craving to do bad. וכבר אמר שלמה המלך עליו השלום כיוסף בזן. We find pesukim in the Tanakh that come to support this idea of the philosophers. Nefesh rasha iveta ra. Right? The nefesh of an evil person is always has ta'ava, always has a craving to do bad, to do evil. ואמר בשמחת החסיד במעשה הטוב, and Shlomo HaMelech also said regarding the Sadiq, someone who craves doing good, v'hitzta'ed, right? However, he does a good deed. However, he feels, sorrow for needing to overcome his true passion. V'hitzta'ed mishe'eno Sadiq ba'asiyata, zeh ha'ma'amar, it says, simcha l'Sadiq asot mishpat u'mechita lefu'alei avin. Right? So, joy of the Sadiq is to do, to make himself do the mishpat, what's required of him. זהו הנראה מדברי הנביאים נאות למה שזכרו הפילוסופים. So this is what we see, this is a sample of what we see in the books of the Nevi'im that come to support this idea of the philosophers. However, וכאשר חקרנו בדברי חכמים בזה העניין, נמצא להם שהמתאבן לעבירות ונחשף אליהן הוא יותר חשוב ויותר שלם. It says, however, we see many statements of the Chachamim, right, regarding these two types of people, saying that he who craves to do an averah, and he wants to do an averah, however he overcomes that desire, says yoter hashuv yoter, he's on a higher level. They ascribe him a higher level. Right? The higher level than someone who has no craving, let's say, for a cheeseburger. Right? Someone has a craving for it. She says, no, it's asur, it's not kasher, I'm not going to do it. Right? And he feels bad that he can't, for years and years he's been keeping non-kosher, and now he's doing teshuvah, and all these things that he used to love to eat, he can't anymore, and now he needs to overcome this desire that he has, and he feels bad that he can't enjoy what he's enjoying, but he's doing it for the sake of the Torah. The Chachamim say he's on a much higher level, right, than someone who's never even had that craving to begin with. Never needed to overcome that desire. Ad she'amiru, right, to the point that they say, shekol asher yeh ha'adam yoter hashuv veyoter shalem, tiyeh teshukato la'averot veitzta'aro b'hanachatan yoter gadol. Right, and the Chachamim say that the greater a person is, I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, it says, right, medaktek im ha'sadikim kechut ha'sa'ara, right, or kol gadol mehavero yisro gadol mimeno, right? Anyone who is greater than his peers and his friend, his yetzer to do bad is even greater, meaning he has to put in more effort in order to overcome those desires to do something that is asur. והביאו בזה הדברים ואמרו, and this is what the Chachamim say, כל הגדול מחברו יסרו גדול ממנו. Anyone who is greater, his yetzer is stronger. ולא דיים זה, and this is not enough, עד שאמרו, right, החכמים said, ששכר המושל בנפשו, גדול לפי רוב צערו במושלו בנפשו. The החכמים say that the sachar that you get, right, the reward that you get for overcoming your yetzer is a function of how difficult it was for you to overcome that yetzer. Amru lefum sa'ara agra. So the sachar is in accordance to your sorrow, right? The worse you felt in overcoming this desire, the greater the sachar is. ויותר מזה שהם ציוו נהיות האדם מתאווה לעבירות. They said a man should have desired for averot. והזהירו מלומר, and they said, שאני בטבעי לא אתאווה לזאת העבירה. They said a man shouldn't say, I do not have a craving for this עבירה, ואף על פי שלא אסרה התורה, even if the Torah did not forbid it, right? I have no craving to do such an עבירה. והוא אומרם, and this is what they say, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, right? He was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the president of the Supreme Court. Lo yomar adam I afshi le'echol basar b'halav. He says a man shouldn't say, I have no desire to eat milk and meat together. I afshi lilbosh sha'atnez. I have no desire to wear sha'atnez, right? Semer upishtim together. I have no desire, right, to sleep with a beautiful woman. And if she, you should say, if she, my nefesh does crave it. He says, however, I'm not going to do it. He says, I crave to do these things. I do want to have a cheeseburger. However, what can I do? God forbade it, and therefore I will not do these averot. So we see two conflicting approaches between the philosophers and between the hachamim. And not only that, but the philosophers' approach seems to also be supported by Shlomo HaMelech, right? So what's going? Does anyone have any ideas to maybe make peace between them, to reconcile these two approaches? Anybody? Any ideas? ולפי המובן מפשוטי שני המאמרים בתחילת המחשבה הם סותרים זה את זה ואין העניין כן. He says when you first read these two approaches, they seem to be conflicting. He says, but it's not true. It's only when you first look at it. It's not true. They're not conflicting. אבל שניהם אמת. He says both statements, both approaches are true. ואין מחלוקת ביניהם כלל. And there is no difference between these two approaches. והוא, and this is why, שהרעות אשר הן אצל הפילוסופים רעות, אשר אמרו שמי שלא יתאווה אליהן יותר חשוב מנתאווה אליהן ויכבוש את יצרו מהן, הם העניינים המפורסמים אצל כל בני אדם שהם רעות. It says when the philosophers, right, the Greek philosophers, the goyim, when they're talking about things that are forbidden to do, that a person craves to do, they're not talking about eating meat and milk. They're talking about things that is common sense to everybody, that these are evil deeds, like murder, like stealing. And so, if your nefesh is craving those things, it says, yeah, that's indicative of a corrupted nefesh. And it's true. What they're saying is true. Right, like bloodshed, ugneva, vegezen, ve'ona'ah, like cheating people and stealing from people, ulhazik lemí shelo heralo, or causing damage to people, or vandalism, v'ligmol ra lemitivlo, or to do something bad to someone who did something good to you, ולבזות אב ואם וכיוצא באלו, and disrespecting your parents. והן המצוות שאמרו עליהן חכמים זיכרונם לברכה, שאילו לא נכתבו, ראויין הן להיכתב. And these are the mitzvot that the Chachamim said, if these mitzvot wouldn't have been written in the Torah, then we would have had to institute it ourselves, right? Meaning these are common laws you'll find in every legal system, right? In every society, that anybody who transgresses these laws, it's indicative of a corrupted nefesh, and a society cannot sustain itself without these laws. ויקראו אותן מצד חכמינו האחרונים אשר חנו חולי המדברים מצוות השכליות. It says in some of our later Chachamim, those who went according to these Islamic philosophers known as the Mutakalam, the Kalam or the Mutakalimun, in Hebrew they call it Kata Midabirim, right? They refer to these mitzvot as mitzvot sikhliyot, logical mitzvot, right? It's mitzvot that anybody with common sense would think of. ואין ספק שהנפש אשר תחזוף לדבר מהם ותשתוקק אליו שהיא חסרה, right? And without any doubt, any nefesh, any person who craves any of these deeds, to steal and to kill and to cheat, right? Then there's something wrong with his nefesh. ושהנפש החשובה לא תתאווה לאחד מאלו הרעות כלל, right? But someone with a perfected nefesh, with a healthy nefesh, will have no craving to ever do any of these things. ולא תצטער בהימנעה מהם. And they won't feel conflicted, or they won't feel any sorrow in preventing themselves from not doing these averot. אבל הדברים שאמרו עליהם החכמים, שהכובש את ישרו מהם הוא יותר חשוב וגמולו יותר גדול, right? However, the mitzvot or the averot that the Chachamim referred to when they said that somebody who prevents himself from doing these averot, he's on a higher level, and he gets greater sachar because he needs to overcome this inclination to do this averah. He says him what those Chachamim will refer to as ha-torot or ha-mitzvot ha-shim'iyot, right? These are the mitzvot that we have to, they call the obeying mitzvot, meaning they're not necessarily logical. We obey them only for the sake that we were commanded not to do these mitzvot, or not to do these averot. וזה אמת, and this is true, שאלמלא התורה לא היו רעות כלל. Right? If there wouldn't have been an explicit mitzvah in the Torah forbidding these actions, then there'd be nothing wrong with it. Right? Why is it asur to eat horse? It's not asur to eat horse if you're not Jewish. Right? It's asur because it's not kasher. Why is it a problem to eat milk and meat together? Only because the Torah forbade it. If you're not Jewish, go ahead. There's nothing wrong with it. She'inmaleh Torah, if it weren't for the Torah explicitly forbidding it, there's nothing wrong with it. And because of this, they say שצריך האדם שיניח נפשו אוהבת אותם ולא יהיה לו מונע מהן רק התורה. Says, and because of this, a person shouldn't say he doesn't crave these things. He should crave these things for the sake that when he overcomes that craving, the only reason he's overcoming that craving is his love for the Torah, for following the mitzvot of the Torah, not because he has no own desire to do these things. Ubechan chokhmatam, he says, and look at their wisdom, alehim shalom, right? Peace be upon them. Ubema shehim shinu shehem lo amru, right? And this is the quotation that they gave. They didn't say, al yomar adam if shila harok ita nefesh. They didn't say a person shouldn't say oh, I have no desire to murder. I have no desire to steal. I have no desire to cheat and to lie. However, I do have this desire, to cheat and kill and everything, but I'm not going to do it because God forbade me. Says that's not what the Hachamim said. Anyone who desires to do these things, there's something wrong with him. אבל הביאו דברים שמעיים כולם. All the examples that they brought of a person saying, I have a desire for this, however, I won't do it because God forbade it, right? There are all these things that they're only assumed because the Torah explicitly forbade it. Dvarim shim'iyim, not necessarily logical things that anybody else would come up with. Basar b'halav, eating meat and milk together. Nevishat sha'anez, wearing cotton and linen mixed together. Va'arayot, relations. Ve'elu ha-misvot v'chayoseh bahen, and all of these misvot, and all of this category of misvot, hen asher kira'an Hashem yitbarach hukot. These are the misvot that HaKadosh Baruch Hu referred to as hukot, as laws. And v'amru rebotenu, and the Hachamim says, Zichronam livracha, hukim shehakakti lecha ve'en lecha reshut leharher bahem. Says these are laws that I instituted, and you can't outsmart them. You can't try to annul them with your logic. Why? Because they're not necessarily logical. I mean, there's a reasoning for them. However, they're not something you would come up with common sense. I instituted them, and you need to obey them. Those are called hukot. And the goyim yeshivin alehem, right? And the goyim, they come and they challenge us on these misvot. It says v'hasatan mekatreg bahem, and the Satan comes and he says, look, well, but they try to make us. The Satan comes, he tries to make us. He says, well, there's no logic to this mitzvah. If you this avera, if you transgress this avera, no harm is really going to happen to you. Kegon para aduma, v'seira mishtaleach, right? So para aduma, the red heifer, and the seir mishtaleach, the goat that we send out on Yom Kippur. These are things that there is no seemingly logical purpose to them. We do it primarily because the Torah commanded us to do it. And those are called hukot, right? Zot hukat Torah, right? This is the huk of the Torah, right? Adam ki yamut ba'ohen, amanu passes away in a ohen, right? And then brings all the laws of para aduma, right? Does anybody here, with as creative as they may be, would they come up with these series of laws? In fact, I'd like to say, in my opinion, almost all the laws regarding the sacrifices, they're very, very precise, and they come for that specific reason of following God's word to the letter, only because God commanded us to do it exactly in this way. Otherwise, nothing would compel us to behave in this way. There is no logical pathway, right? Thinking way that says, let's do para aduma. This is a great way to purify ourselves from tumat metim. It says, no, we do this exactly as we do it because God instructed us to do it exactly as He instructed us to do it. And this is how we show our obedience and our love to God. And that's why they're called HaTorot HaShim'iyot. It's a matter of obedience. That's where we show we're doing this only because God instructed us to do it. V'asher karu otan harunim sichmiyot, right? And the other misvot, which the Hachamim, the later Hachamim refer to as logical misvot, yikreu misvot, right? The Torah refers to them as misvot in general, commandments, regular commandments, laws, kifi ma shebe'aru Hachamim, as the Hachamim have stated. Hine hitba'er lecha mikol ma she'amarnu ezo min ha'averot yemi shelo yishtokek elehem yoter hashuv min ha'mishtokek elehem. So we see First of all, there is no real conflict between the philosophers and the Hachamim on this matter. Who is greater? Somebody who has a desire to do Avirot. Well, if it's the kind of Avirot that the philosophers are talking about, because they don't have our Torah, they don't have these laws of not eating meat and milk together, but the laws that they're talking about is cheating people and stealing and bloodshed, then yes, that person is on a lower level. Right? וכובש ישרו מהן איזו מהן העניין בהפך. Right? וזה חידוש נפלא בעמיד שני המאמרים. Right? This is the great understanding, great חידוש, when you understand the different perspectives of the philosophers and the Hachamim, and you're able to reconcile based on understanding what each one is talking about and not just what they are saying. Right? They're saying, their statements conflict. However, when you understand what each one's talking about, you can reconcile them and understand that they're really not in any disagreement. Right? And the precise formulation of what the Hachamim said, right, comes to support what I explained here in this chapter. Because they didn't bring examples of, I desire to steal, I desire to kill. They brought examples of, I desire to eat meat and milk, and I desire to have forbidden relations. And all these things, if it weren't for the Torah, wouldn't be a problem. Any questions on this chapter? So this is a short chapter. The next chapter is also short. We'll get started on it as well. Although it's a little bit more deep. It's a little bit deeper. Any questions so far on the 6th chapter? Or any insight, any statement? Looks like Lena wants to say something, but I can't hear you. All right, okay, so if there's nothing, we will continue. Right, this was the purpose of this chapter. The Perek HaShevi'i, 7th chapter, right? The barriers between us and God. It says, Harbei maseh b'midrashot u'ba'agadot. And by the way, we've quoted this chapter a few times in the previous course on the fundamentals of Judaism according to Maimonides. We've quoted this chapter a few times, different parts of the chapter. It says, Harbei maseh b'midrashot u'ba'agadot, v'yesh mehen b'gemara, or b'talmud. We'll see many midrashot, many midrashim, many agadot throughout the Talmud, right? That say, sheyesh min ha-nevi'im, that some of the prophets, mi shirei Hashem yitbarach ma'achorei mechisot rabot, some of the prophets, when they perceive God, they perceive Him behind multiple barriers. Umehem yishireu ma'achorei mechisot mu'atot, and those who will perceive God, view God with less barriers. לפי חנוותם אל השם יתברך ולפי מעלתם בנבואה. Right, this is all a function of their closeness to God or their level of prophecy. עד שאמרו, right, to the point where they said, משה רבנו עליו השלום, ראה השם יתברך מאחורי מחיסה אחת בהירה. To the point where Moshe was on the highest level of prophecy, closest to God. It says, "Lo kam b'Yisrael ki Moshe od navi u'mabit et emunato." Right? There is no other prophet like Moshe among the Jewish people. He says Moshe reached a level where he perceived God mechore mechisa achat behira. He perceived God behind one barrier, and that barrier was a transparent barrier. Klomar mazhira. Vehu omram, and this is what they say. Istakel ba'aspaklaria ha'me'ira. Says regarding Moshe that Moshe perceived God through a transparent spectacle, like through a mirror or through a window that you can see through. The aspaklaria, and what is an aspaklaria? It's a word in Greek. Says שם המראה הנעשה מגוף המזהין כשוהם וזכוכית. Aspaklaria is like a mirror or a transparent substance that you can see through, like a diamond or like glass. כמו שהתבאר בסוף כנים, as we explain at the end of מסכת כנים. Remember, this is all part of Pirush Mishnah, and Masechet Kenim, he also brings the whole commentary there and explains the word Aspaklaria. והכוונה בזה העניין, מה שאומר לך. Right? And what is the meaning that Moshe perceived God behind one transparent barrier? והוא שאנחנו ביארנו בפרק השני. We have already explained in the second chapter of the 8 chapters of the Shemona Perakim, שהמעלות, מהן מעלות שכליות ומהן מעלות המידות. Right? There are 2 types of virtues a person can have. There could be his intellectual virtues, ma'alot sichliyot, right? Such as he's a quick learner, he understands things well, he's able to solve great math problems, he's able to understand complex ideas. And the other type of virtue, ma'alot hamidot, a person's character, his characteristic traits, how he behaves. וכן הפחיתויות, and so to his inequities, מהן פחיתויות שכליות. Right? There are 2 types of these inequities. There's intellectual ones. He can't understand. He doesn't listen. Right? כסכלות ומיעוט ההבנה. Right? That he's a fool. ודוחק התבונה. He has a hard time learning new things. ומהן פחיתויות המידות. And also his character, he could have flawed character. כרוב התאווה, he has tremendous ta'ava for doing things that he shouldn't. V'haga'ava, then he has a lot of pride. V'harogis, and he's angry. V'ha'azut, and he has chutzpah. V'ahavat ha'mamon, and he's greedy. V'adomenahen. Right? These are all examples of inequities of flawed character. V'hen rabot me'od, and there are many, many of these. U'kvar zacharnu. Haseder b'diatan b'perek ha'revi'i, and we already explained them in a lot more detail in the 4th chapter, right? And how to cure yourself from them, and how to stay away from them, and how to heal yourself. Ve'elu ha'pchituyot kulan, and all of these inequities, all of these flaws, hen ha'machisot ha'mavdilot ben ha'adam u'ben Hashem yitbarach. These are the barriers between man and God. Ma'amar ha'navi mevayer zeh, right? The statement of the Navi, Yeshayahu, he says, Ki im avonotechem hayu mavdilim benechem leben Elohechem. It says your avonot, right? Your bad behavior, your inequities, your flaws, those are the barriers. Those are what's separating between you and your God. Yomar, he's saying, she'avonotenu, our avonot, vehen haraot, these are our iniquities, כמו שזכרנו, הן המחיסות, המבדילות, בינינו ובינו יתברך. These are the barriers between us and God. So the closer you are to God, what does that mean, the closer you are to God? It means the less flaws that you have, the more you perfected yourself, the more you perfected your character, the more you perfected your intellectual capacity. These things all bring you closer to God, or as the way the Hachamim would say, these are tearing down these barriers between us and God. Veda, and you should know, shekol navi lo nitnaba elachar shayu lo kol hama'alot hasichliot verov hama'alot hamidot v'hazakot shebahen. So you should know, all of the prophets, anyone who actually reached the state of prophecy, it's only after he perfected his intellectual capacity as much as possible, and his character, and he acquired the majority and the most important of the characteristic traits, of the proper characteristic traits. And this is what they say, Ein hanivua shora ela al hacham gidor ve'ashir. He says prophecy does not come to somebody unless he is hacham, he is wise, he is gibor. Gibor We'll explain it a little bit more soon, and we've explained before. Gibor means he's courageous, ve'ashir, and then he is wealthy. So what are these things? Hacham, hu kolel kol ha'ma'alot ha'sechniyot, but this includes all of man's intellectual virtues. Ve'ashir, what does it mean? Ashir is someone who is wealthy. Hu min ma'alot ha'midot. This has to do with man's characteristic traits. Sunin omar ha'istapkut. Mipnei shehem korin ha'mistapek ashir. Someone who is happy with what he has. He works hard, he makes a living, and he's not greedy. And he's not always chasing the next best deal. And this is what they say about someone who is wealthy, someone who is happy with what he receives. He works, God sends him his parnasah, and he's happy with what God provides for him. Right? Whatever effort he put in to get, or whatever reward he got from the effort he put in, he's happy. And he's not going to miss. He says, oh, I could have made more, I could have done better. He says, Vechen gibor. And what is a gibor? Someone who is courageous, someone who is a hero. What is heroism? This too is also has to do with a person's character. It is Sonin Omar. I want to say what I mean is this is somebody who has the strength to overcome his desires and lead his actions and his nefesh, as we discussed in chapter 5, to lead his nefesh in accordance to his intellect. As we already explained in the 5th chapter of Amro, this is what the Chachamim say, Ezehu Gibor HaKovesh et Yisro. Who is a Gibor, who is a hero? He who is able to overcome his Yetzer. And if you remember, we spoke previously about another Pasuk of Shlomo, right, where he says, Tov Erech Apayim Gibor, someone who has patience, is able to overcome. Right, it says someone angers you and you have patience, you don't respond right away. That's called erech apayim. It says tov erech apayim migibor. Right, that is much better than being a gibor, of a hero, or the kovesh et yisro, and someone who's able to overcome his yetzer. The kovesh et yisro min loched ir, than somebody who conquers an entire city. Right. This is the real Gibor, is he was able to control himself and not project his control over others. All right, and so too, one of the requirements of being a Navi, kol ma'alot hamidot ad shelo tefhitehu bechitut. Right, so part of being a Navi is to have all of these characteristic virtues, and not to have, or at least not to have any of these flaws. Right? The Navi doesn't have to have all. Like it's not like he can't have any flaw at all. There is no such thing as a Sadiq who has no flaws. Right? Right? It says in Sefer Menachim, it says God revealed himself to Shlomo. And we see that Shlomo HaMelech also had characteristic flaws. He had tremendous ta'ava. He had 1,000 wives. Right? And he had many wives. And this is all a function of having too much ta'ava. And it says explicitly that this was Shlomo's downfall. This was Shlomo's migrah. But that didn't prevent him from not having nevuah at all. We also see with David, alav shalom, him too, David Amar, li diber sur Israel. We see that David HaMelech himself also received prophecy. And we see that David HaMelech himself, he also had a bit of cruelty in him. That he went out and he killed many, many people. אף על פי שלא שימש בהקים בעובדי גילונים ובהריגת הכופרים, even though he only did it when he was killing our enemies, והיה רחמן לישראל, he was very, very merciful towards Israel, the Jewish people. אבל בא בביאור בדברי הימים, and we see in דברי הימים at the end, שהשם יתברך לא הרשהו לבנות בית המקדש, that God did not permit him to build the temple, ולא היה ראוי בעיניו לזה לרוב מה שהרג. And what didn't seem right to him in his own eyes because of all of the killing. Amar, it says, אתה לא תבנה בית לשמי, כי דמים רבים שפכת ארצה לפניי. It says, you are not, it's not proper for you to build the Mikdash in my name on account of all of the bloodshed that you did. I just like to say, they say a real Maimonidean has no problem also disagreeing with the Rambam, right? Maimonideans, they're independent thinkers, and the same way as Maimonides many times has, disagrees with the Geonim before him and the Hachamim before him, they say also any Maimonidean also feels free to disagree with the Rambam. I, on this point, I don't accept the Rambam's interpretation. I think it's very difficult to say David HaMelech and Achzari. We say Kol HaMerachem and Achzarim Sofo Litachzer LeRachmanim. Right? Anybody who has mercy towards cruel people, and that's where David, that's where he executed his so-called cruelty. Right? In the end, he's going to have cruelty towards merciful people, and we see that all the time with our completely with a mushhat, our completely skewed policy towards our enemies, showing them too much mercy on account of our own soldiers, on account of our own people. And the Hachamim, actually, they take this pasuk and they say, Ki damim rabim shafachta arsa lefanai, right? Because you shed so much blood, spilled it on the ground before me. They say arsa, right? Al haaretz tishpachenu kasevi v'chayal. They say all of the bloodshed of David HaMelech, God viewed as korbanot before him. Same way it says kasevi v'chayal, right? As you spill the blood of a tzivina ayal, so too David HaMelech when he spilled the blood of deer. So lefanai, he says also lefanai is like lifnei hamizbeach, as if he did it for God's sake. And really, if you really read the Pesukim in depth, this is all really just David's own projection. He felt unworthy because of all of his bloodshed, and the Pesukim don't really suggest that he wasn't worthy. And the Hachamim definitely, not only do they not suggest that he wasn't worthy, they say he was most worthy, to the point where they say the reason why God didn't want David to build the Mikdash is because David was on such a high level that if he would have built the Mikdash, God never would have let it been destroyed. And that was a lesson that we needed to have, that the Mikdash itself could be destroyed. So he postponed it to David's next generation, Shlomo. All right, that's my point. You're welcome to take Maimonides' point. This is the one place that I kind of have difficulty with Maimonides' interpretation. Umasanu be'Eliyahu zechur latov, and we see regarding Eliyahu Navi, midat haragzanut v'af al pi sheshimesh ba bakofrim v'alehem haya koes. And we also see that with Eliyahu Navi, he also had this anger, even though he redirected it towards the kofrim, and he only used it against them. ואמרו החכמים, החכמים זה שהשם יתברך לקחו ואמר לו, God took him and he said, שאינו ראוי למשול בבני אדם ולהיות להם לכהן, that he is not fit to serve as their priest. Remember, Eliyahu Navi, according to the Hachamim, he is Pinchas, who we just read about in last week's Perashah. Pinchas bin Elazar bin Aharon HaKohen, right? He was the high priest. He was promised the priesthood, but eventually we see with Eliyahu that that office was taken away from him because he had too much of this zealousy. And even though he directed it towards the Kofrim, right, the Ovdei Avodah Zarah and Har Carmel, we see that when he went to Har Horeb, God needed to calm him down, right? God says, Lo bara'ash Hashem. God doesn't reveal himself in these great storms. He says, calm down, all right? Lo ba'esh Hashem. God doesn't reveal himself in great fire. Says Va'ishma, and I shall hear kol demamadaka, a subtle sound, a subtle voice. Right? That's how God reveals himself. You need to calm yourself down. And if you have too much of this zealousy, then you can't really receive this nivuah. Right? So even though he had the zealousy and nivuah wasn't always available to him, right? He had this tichunah in his nefesh, he was still able to receive nivuah every now and then. מי שיש לו קנאה כמו שיש לו, כי ימיתם. וכן מסינו בשמואל. And we also see regarding Shemuel, שפחד משאול. Shemuel הנביא had fear of Shaul. And Yaakov, שפחד מפגישת Esav. Yaakov was afraid, or he worried before meeting his brother, Esav. אלו המידות וכיוצא בהן, הן מחיסות בין השם יתברך עם הנביאים. All of these inequities, these flaws in your character, these are the barriers between us and God. And we see even the Nevi'im, they have barriers between us and God, meaning you don't have to be completely perfect in order to receive Nevuah. You could have flaws, certain characteristic flaws, right? Or we'll call it more certain imperfections, not flaws, but not have pristine 100% character. Even, by the way, Moshe himself, and we've discussed this in previous class, right? Moshe himself wasn't perfect. And he too, right, obviously received Nevuah, the highest level of Nevuah. ומי שיש לו שתי מידות, ושלוש מהן בלתי ממוסעות, כמו שבאנו בפרק הרביעי, נאמר בו, שראה השם יתברך מאחורי שתי מחיסות, או שלוש. So somebody who has 2 or 3 characteristic flaws, so this is what the Hachamim would refer to as they revealed, or they God revealed them, so they perceived God behind 2 or 3 barriers. ולא תרחיק היות חסרון כסת המידות ממעט ממדרגת הנבואה. And so having some imperfection in your midot isn't necessarily going to prevent you from having nevuah. שאנחנו מסינו קצת בחיתות המידות ימנעו הנבואה לגמרי. We see that some characteristic flaws will completely take nevuah away from you, even if you had kakas, such as anger. אמרו, כל הכועס, אם נביא הוא, נבואתו מסתלקת ממנו. Says anybody who gets angry, if he is a prophet, he loses his prophecy. והביאו ראיה מאלישע שנסתלקה ממנו הנבואה כשכעס. Right? And they brought the Hachamim, they brought an example from Elisha that when he got mad, right, his nevuah was taken away from him עד שהסירו כעסו, until he overcame his anger. והוא אומרו, this is what it says, ועתה כחוני מנגן. Right, he saw that he's not receiving prophecy, that he needs to overcome his anger, he needs to settle down, and he said, bring before me someone, to play an instrument, a musician, to calm me down. בעבור להנחה והדאגה של יעקב אבינו, עליו השלום, כל ימי התאבלו על יוסף, נסתלקה ממנו רוח הקודש. It says, regarding Yaakov Avinu, he was mourning the disappearance of Yosef for many years. That entire time that he was in mourning, he had no nivuah. Ruach HaKodesh left him. עד שנתבשר בחייו, אמר ותחי רוח יעקב אביהם. Says until he got the report that Yosef is alive. And then the pasuk after that says, Vatehi Ruach Yaakov Avihem, the spirit of Yaakov, their father, right, came back to life. Amar HaMitargem, right, and Onkel who says, Visharat Ruach Nevuah Yaakov Abuhon. He says that Nevuah came back, was restored to Yaakov. Vatehi Ruach Yaakov Avihem, his spirit came alive, means he once again received Ruach HaKodesh. Leshon HaChamim, and this is what the Chachamim say in a nevuah shora, lo mitoch aslut, velo mitoch asvut, ela mitoch simcha. Right? So even if you have a momentary flaw, it says the nevuah won't come to you if you are in a depression or if you are sad. It says ela mitoch simcha. You have to be emotionally uplifted. You need to be in a good state, and only then can you receive נבואה. וכאשר ידע משה רבנו, and when Moshe knew שלא נשארה לו מחיסה, שלא הסיר אותה, he realized he overcame all of his character flaws. וכי נשלמו בו מעלות המידות כולן והמעלות השכליות כולן. He reached a level where he overcame or he perfected his intellect as much as human can, and he perfected his character, right, to the ultimate perfection. ביקש להשיג מהות השם יתברך על אמיתת מציאותו. He wanted to perceive God as is. אחר שלא נשאר לו מונע, right, since he has already overcome all his barriers, there's nothing preventing him from now perceiving God as is. Amar hare'eni nā et kibodecha. He said, show me your glory. V'hodi'o Hashem yitbarach she'i efshar lo lezeh b'yoto sechel nimtza b'chomer. He says, and God told him that this is impossible as an intellect still confounded by material, by his physical being. It is impossible for him to perceive God as is, by virtue of him being human. This is what he says, says, man cannot perceive me alive. He says, and therefore there was no barrier left between Moshe Rabbeinu and God, but this one transparent barrier. This is one barrier that cannot be taken down. And this is human intellect, which is not separated from physical or the material world. Our perception is always confounded by our senses, by the way we perceive the world, by our material understanding. וגמל אליו יתברך חסד, בתת לו מן ההשגה, אחר ששאלה יותר ממה שהיה אצלו קודם שאלתו. However, God did provide him with a higher understanding than he had previously had by virtue of his question, of his request. And he told him, he said, this is impossible for man to elevate himself to this state because he is material. Right? And he gave an allegory. He says, understanding God as is considered a iyat panim, like seeing a person's face. Because when a person sees his friend, his face, right, and he's able to completely, right, differentiate him from any other person. Even when he's not before him, right? When you think of a person, you think of their face, right? However, when you see his behind, right, you see how a person walks, you see him from afar, right? You can understand a lot about him, but you don't see him, right? You could say, okay, maybe this is my friend, maybe it's someone else who, behaves or has the same mannerisms as him. אף על פי שהוא מכירו בראייה ההיא, פעמים יסתפק עליו ויתערב לו עם זולתו. He may confuse him with someone else, right? I'm not going to delve more into this. There's a lot to discuss on this. We've already discussed this in depth in our previous course. The first chapter of Hilchot Yesodei Torah is probably a second or third class in the previous course on the fundamentals of Judaism. כן השגתו יתברך על האמת, ידיעת השם יתברך מאמיתת מציאותו, מה שלא ישתתף במציאות ההיא זולתו מן הנמצאות. So what does that mean? It means that when he wanted to understand God as is, he wanted to know God on the highest level, where he's completely differentiated from everything in the world as we know it, right? He's completely transcendent, and not this is an act of God, but what is God itself, which is something that man can't actually perceive as is. עד שימצא בנפשו מציאותו חזקה ונבדלת על מה שנמצא בנפשו ממציאות שאר הנמצאות. That's what I just explained. ואי אפשר לאדם להשיג זה השיעור מן ההשגה, and this is not something that is accessible to man, אלא שהוא עליו השלום. However, משה רבנו השיג למטה מזה מעט. Right? His perception was lesser than that, and not that, lesser than that. However, much more than what anybody else can perceive. Right? Lo kan be'Yisrael k'Moshe od. Right? There will be no other prophet on the level of Moshe. And this is what he says. V'ra'ita et achorai, you should see me from behind. Right? You cannot see perceive my face. All right? Says, I am going to expound on this a lot more on the book of prophecy. It is a book that the Rambam intended to write, called the book of prophecy, and then he didn't actually write it. He incorporated it into the guide for the perplexed. And we discussed this a lot more in detail in that earlier class in the previous course. וכאשר ידעו חכמים זיכרונם לברכה, and when the חכמים knew ששני המינים האלו מן הפחיתויות, רצוני לומר השכליות והמידות, right, when the חכמים, right, they knew that these two types of flaws, whether they are characteristic flaws or intellectual flaws, הם אשר יבדילו בין השם יתברך ובין האדם, right, these are the separations, the barriers between man and God. ובהן הוא יתרון מעלת הנביאים, and in this, in overcoming these flaws, you can distinguish between the different levels of the prophets. אמרו על קצתם במה שראו מחוכמתם ומדותיהם, right, so they said regarding some of the prophets from what they perceived of their character and of their wisdom, or also regarding other Nevi'im, other Hachamim in their times, right, they are worthy. So a way of saying that someone is of a flawless character, is of great character, is saying this person is worthy of having nevuah as Moshe Rabbeinu. ולא יעלה ממך עניין הדמיון שהם דימו אותם. Bohr says, and don't say, they say, well, this person should be worthy of prophecy like Moshe, that's an ikar, that nobody could receive prophecy like Moshe. He says, no, they're just resembling this person's actions, right, this person's character. We actually saw this in one of the later classes in the course on introduction to the oral Torah, right, where Rabbi Avraham ibn Daud, one of the students of Rabbi Ishaq al-Fasi, who wrote Sefer Kabbalah, he's speaking of one of his teachers, Rabbi Yosef al-Nevi ibn Megas, He says that you can tell by his character that he is descendant of Moshe Rabbeinu because he has tremendous anavah, tremendous humility. He's very humble. He says you can tell because he's a Levi. He says you can tell that he is descendant of Moshe Rabbeinu, right? He says no sheishvum. It's not that they compared him to Moshe Rabbeinu. Says God forbid. He says they're resembling him to Moshe because he has such great character, as Moshe had such great character. So they're not comparing, they're resembling him to him. And so they said regarding other Hachamim, right, right, that they're worthy of having Shekhinah on them, having prophecy like Yehoshua ala tzad asher zachanu. All this is in the same heartbeat, in the same way of speaking, right? This is what we wanted to explain in this chapter, right? So our virtues and our flaws, this is the measurement of our closeness to God. The barriers standing between us and God, first of all, is all a matter of our control. It's a function of our behavior. Our behavior dictates our character, right? Our characteristics, our nefesh, the perfection of our nefesh. The more we work on ourselves, the closer we come to God, the more barriers we're tearing down that are preventing us from perceiving God. All right? And forgot what I wanted to say. All right, and I'm sorry, I was just about to say something. I forgot what it was. If I remember, I'll bring it up. Any questions on the class so far? So far, this is the end of the class. Any questions? Questions, comments, always welcome. All right, okay. So we're finished with the 7th chapter, 6th and 7th chapter of the 8 chapters. We have 1 chapter left. It's a long one, so it may take 2, maybe even 3 sessions. And looking forward to starting it with you all next week. And so that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Toda Rabba.
Yes, my pleasure.
תודה רבה.
Pleasure. Erev Tov, everybody. I'm stop recording.
Erev Tov.